all. This is Miss Gabriel here again. I'm going to go over Chapter 5, Part 2, which is Modules 16 and 17 on speciation and niches. We're going to start with speciation, which is when one species splits into two or more. So I'm going to try and go fast. I always say that, I know. So a couple little things to point out that you may not have seen in your book, but it helps with remembering. Allo means different, sim means same. That's going to help you with just remembering. I'm just trying to give you some suggestions. But new species come about or evolve through two processes, allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. Before we actually get into one species turning into two species, there are some rules or prerequisites for speciation. One, the original population must separate into smaller populations that won't interbreed. And two, the separated populations must be exposed to different pressures. We're going to go over these, and the pressures are considered selective pressures. For example, looking at foxes experiencing two different selective pressures here. The Arctic and the gray fox have a common ancestor, just like dogs have common ancestors of wolves. Selective pressures for the Arctic fox in the north is the cold, and the gray south is the warm climate. These are different selective pressures that serve as prereqs to speciation from the original ancestral fox. Remember, new species evolve allopatrically or sympatrically. So allopatric speciation is caused by isolation. In this case, geography or reproductive, like DNA, isolate one population enough that it can no longer reproduce with its original population. It's all about isolation, which will not be sympatric. So again, looking at allopatric speciation, geographic barriers split. So we have these, there's no barrier here geographically, and then it splits just because over time that happens. The Earth's crust moves and changes all the time. Natural selection may favor different traits in the environment of each isolated population, resulting in different adaptations. And over time, the two populations may become so genetically distinct that they're no longer capable of interbreeding. Now, I'm not going to play this video for you, but I want you to look it up and play it on your own, because I'll get in trouble if I play it for you from YouTube. So I'm going to fly ahead on it. But look up speciation. It's going to be by e-chalk, and you're going to see these little lumpties, and it's going to give you a funny little cartoony scenario. They're talking, they're playing, and they will get geographically isolated from one another, which that has to do with allopatric speciation. So you take a look at that so you can understand that concept a little more. Then there's sympatric speciation. So they're not geographically or reproductively isolated. Flowering plants such as wheat commonly form new species through the process of something called polyploidy, which is an increase in the number of sets of chromosomes beyond the normal 2 sets, which is like diploid. So we have 3 different types of wheat here. These little brown things are the seeds. We're going to start with the ancestral wheat. It has 2 sets of chromosomes and produces real small seeds. And then we have durum wheat. This is what we used for pasta. And this was bred to have 4 sets of chromosomes and produces medium-sized seeds. And then we have our common wheat, which is used like mostly for bread. And that has 6 sets of chromosomes and produces the largest seeds. So not reproductively or geographically isolated, just the chromosomes have changed. So let's see if you were paying attention. So you're going to pause. You're going to try and complete this flow chart, comparing and contrasting types of speciation. Ready? Pause. Try. I bet you got these all right. And if you didn't, now you know them. So sympatric and allopatric speciation both end up causing or, evolving into 2 new species. So one species turns into 2 or more new species. Okay, and then just here's some pictures, for you to visually compare and review the 2 major types of speciation for you. Remember the story of the finches and the Galapagos. Think of class in the video, and how a group of birds went to the island, leaving the mainland, geographically isolating the group. All right, what do you think are 2 factors that make it difficult for a population to survive? Environmental change. The population has a slow generation time and cannot evolve rapidly enough. That means that an organism like a human lives a long life, not a few days of life. Also, a population is too genetically similar or not genetically diverse. That means there's less of a chance of natural selection to act. Does any of this apply to the dinosaurs? Yes, 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 yes. That's the answer to that. So this is what killed the dinosaurs. Just saying. All right, here's important factors on whether a population goes extinct or carries on. So a species can survive if it can quickly evolve adaptations to the new conditions. And it's not going to evolve very quickly if it has long generation times. That means, it lives for a really long time, or if it contains low genetic variation. And then GMOs, I'm not going to test you on GMOs because we're going to talk about those another time. Just know that a GMO is just like a plant. We use GMOs. There's a lot in the news about it. We'll talk about it another time. Like I said, copying genes from a species and inserting them into another gene. So the answers to Mod 16 review are D, A, B, C. And now we're going on to Module 17. Different traits perform well in some environments, but not in others. Species can tolerate change and adapt. They'll survive. And we've learned how species adapt and evolve. Now we will learn how animals and plants occupy unique niches. Predict which species here survived rapid environmental change. And by the way, environmental change could be like climate that makes the environment colder. So that's an environmental change. So guess which one would survive a sudden colder climate? And other changes environmentally could be human development or a climate that gets warmer. Guess. You were right, the mouse. The mouse survives rapid change. This is because they have different survival strategies and niches. So we're going to learn about that. Different survival strategies and different niches. So describe the mouse's niche. And that's what you kind of need to understand. Like, think about the mouse. The mouse can live anywhere. The mouse, there's a lot of mice. There's never just one. There's not 5. There's not 10. There's like hundreds. And they're different. They're all different. Shorter tails, longer tails, bigger nose, smaller eyes, gray, dark gray, brown. They have a small size. Small size actually helps it with adapting to environmental change. They have a whole lot of babies. That's actually a sign to help it survive environmental change. And by the way, we're not small and we don't have a whole lot of babies. And mice have high migration. So panda is not going to be able to survive in a rapidly changing environment. Now we're going to look at the models for this. Oh, yeah, but before we do, I forgot about this slide. A niche includes everything required for survival and reproduction. So these are the things required for survival and reproduction that are abiotic. Look at the list. Now we're going to look at a food niche example. We're looking at specialized feeding niches of birds on a coastal wetland. This specialization reduces competition and allows sharing of limited resources. For example, the oyster catcher, this guy right here, feeds on clams, mussels, and shellfish using its long, narrow beak. He's able to reduce competition with this guy, the knot sandpiper, for similar food because he has the longer beak and can go into the water more. They might have a competitor for the same food, but their species will survive if they access the food at a different location or using a different tool like a beak. We've watched a few videos and had some activities point out that our world's crops and fisheries are at risk of extinction because of organisms survival in a happy place. That happy place is a temperature range, a humidity range, the just right range for food, nutrients, etc. And if the organism doesn't meet those needs, it will it will stress, and it's not going to be able to reproduce. And then bam, extinction. This happy place is what we call the range of tolerance that a species has adapted to. The niches will be shown next, but before I do that, notice that I have the definition for a realized niche subset under the fundamental niche. Why? Well, that's because it includes both the abiotic and biotic factors. Remember, distribution is just where a species lives around the world. All right, so before I go over the models, let's look at an actual example. So we're going to start by looking at the fundamental and realized niche for the barnacle. Think of Pirates of the Caribbean. So the barnacles lived on the ships and the barnacles lived on the dead pirates. That's what these things are. They're animals. All right. So the thalamus barnacles can live in both deep and shallow intertidal zones. That's these brown guys. So their fundamental niche is all this brown arrow here. This is where they could live based on their tolerance, their range of tolerance. This is the fundamental niche. However, the balanus barnacle competes with the thalamus for the deeper zone. So its fundamental niche is only here on the blue line. This forces the thalamus to occupy a smaller actual niche, which is right here in the higher, drier habitat. And this is shown, in these lines for both of these organisms. So this is the realized niche of the thalamus barnacle. This is what he could have if these guys weren't here. That's considered his competition. Now here's the model for that. The model that applies to all organisms and their niches. All species have an ideal range of abiotic conditions, such as temperature, under which their members can survive, grow, and reproduce. And that's their performance. Their performance is survival, growth, and reproduction. If they leave this orange zone, okay, this is their perfect, realized, and fundamental niche, then they're not going to reproduce anymore. It creates stress on the system for a plant or an animal. Well, then they'll survive and they'll grow. If they leave this zone, they're going to perform even lower, and they're only going to survive. Get it? The organism graph here is shown to be in its fundamental niche when the temperature ranges within the orange zone. That's what you got to remember. So this curve is actually showing a pretty large range. So this organism isn't too picky and finicky. So it has a larger range of tolerance. Some organisms are finicky, and this curve is going to be much steeper, and survival and growth are going to take up a lot more space on it. That's not a good thing, and we'll learn about that. Some other pressures or limits to survival and growth and reproduction are biotics such as predators, competition, disease. You'll see that. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a generalist and a specialist and give you some examples in the next slide. You can pause this and look back at it if you want to, but I'm just going to explain it to you. So I stole this picture just for you to get a better idea of how to transition from niches to generalists and specialists. So take a look at my stolen picture. Pandas are special, so we call them specialists, and raccoons think they're in charge like a general, so they're generalists. Okay? Not really, but really. This was to help you remember. Look at the niches for each animal and notice that the panda has a much more narrow niche that I was telling you about in the last slide. And raccoons, look at how wide their niche is. So they're not picky. They're generally happy in a much wider niche. They have a higher tolerance for a wide range of conditions. The panda can only tolerate a narrow range of conditions. Thinks he's special. Additionally, their niches overlap here. See where the overlap is? So that's competition. Look at what that does for the panda's niche. Now it's even smaller. So they share resources, and one will suffer or die if they share resources, because this competition is going to be putting stress on the population if it's not able to adapt to the conditions or the competition. By the way, you need to know that if this niche or overlap here is even bigger, the bigger overlap means more intense competition. Okay, so which animal here do you think is a specialist and which is a generalist? Well, you shouldn't be able to tell. You should have to ask me a couple questions for you to be able to answer that question. What are the questions that you would ask me in order to determine if this one or this one is the specialist? What would you ask? Pause and think about this. Okay, good thinking. So you should have asked me something about how picky they are with their diet. You should have asked me something about how picky they are with their habitat. That's the type of stuff you should have been thinking about. So the spittlebug on the left feeds on a variety of plants. It's not a picky eater. And if the environment changes, the spittlebug population should not go extinct because they're not picky. However, the leaf beetle to the right has a picky diet and is very sensitive to habitat preference. If the environment changes, this little cutie's in trouble. They could go extinct because they don't have a tolerance for other food and they don't have a tolerance for any changes in the environment. Here's another generalist, and now you should understand why they're hard to get rid of. They tolerate everything. So generalists are survivalists. They also have a high reproductive rate and like hundreds of offspring per birth, lots and lots of eggs, and they lay them every 2 weeks. They're very adaptable to any changing environment. That explains it. I'm not a fan. Ugh. All right, here we see changes in tree species distribution over time. So we're going to start with the loblolly pine, and we're going to look at 18,000 years ago. Notice how cold it was. How do I know how cold it was? Because of the massive ice sheet. You know we're looking at the North American continent, right? So scientists found a lot of pollen from the pine in this location that was fossilized, and that indicated its distribution. And then eyes, follow down the chart, and look at the distribution of the spruce and birch trees. So the green tells you where they were. The darker the green, the more that there were. Now we go back to the pine, and we look at how its distribution changed as the ice sheet retreated, and the climate obviously warmed. It's all over the place, especially more north. And you can predict what the distribution may be in another 6,000 years, can't you? What if the planet continues to warm? What does the loblolly pine do? That's right, it's going to spread more northward. Well, I guess crops would be able to grow in more northward areas too. Yay. By the way, the white areas were areas that were sampled for pollen, and gray was not even sampled. So look at the distribution of the other trees as the climate warmed, and think about how we use this to predict things for the future. So we're going to learn much more about fossils in Chapter 8 for at least 15 minutes. In the meantime, you should give some props to paleontologists, climatologists, geologists, because they're the ones that have told us from their findings and doing all this relative dating and radioactive dating. They know which organisms were here in what order. They're the ones that gave us our phylogenetic tree. They helped us with knowing what came first, second, third. And they're the ones that tell us what the climate looked like then. And they're the ones that tell us what the rocks were like and if geology changed then. Respect. Okay. So you know this. We've talked about this a few times about environmental conditions changing. I like this one here. So average lifespan of a species appears to be about 1 to 10 million years. Humans have been around for about 200,000 years. How much longer do we have? I don't know. Well, so we're in the 6th mass extinction. Not everything goes, just many things go. And how do we know we're in it? Because the number of species going extinct is like, they're dropping like flies right in front of us. It's just ridiculous. It's embarrassing. Why is it embarrassing? Because we're causing half of it. How do we know we're causing it? Because we've learned all about their niches. And we're taking away their niches because we're destroying their habitat. And we're putting competitors in there with the invasive species. And we're hunting them and just killing them or overfishing them. And we're also giving them things that are, they're too picky for, they can't handle pollution. They can't handle climate change. Yeah, it's all us. Indirectly, but it's us. It's our fault. The biological diversity is declining we're going into the 6th mass extinction. Hey, you've seen this. But the last time we kind of looked at this, a lot of these things, not everything, but a lot of them were actually very much like the niche specialist. So you can read this and it makes sense, but would you be able to pick the correct ones or the wrong ones from a multiple choice question? You should test yourself. All right, so here we are again. Look at the arrows. We've had 5 mass extinctions that all happened before humans existed. And we are in the 6th. That does not mean 6 have happened. It means we are in the 6th mass extinction. The last one was about, just so you know, 500 million years ago. And the Module 17 review answers are E, C, D, C, E. Well, that's all for Module 16, 17. I hope you appreciate biodiversity more, feel a little more appreciative of all the species on the planet. I wish you luck on the next exam. This is Mrs. Gabriel signing out.